Welcome. I think we had a terrific start yesterday evening. Introducing this panel, I want to say just two things. Firstly, our overall title is Dealing with a Difficult Past. Poland is obviously dealing with a difficult present at the moment. And I think a question that has to run through the conference and emerge like a subterranean stream in the last session is to what extent the difficult present is a result of the country not sufficiently having dealt with a difficult past in the early 1990s. That's a claim that could obviously be made, but I think we want to explore that in some specificity. The second point is that Confucius famously said that if he was advising a new government, he'd start with the rectification of terms. And one of the problems of the Polish debate, it seems to me, is that we don't have adequate terms for this whole complex. So in German you have the wonderful words Vergangenheitsbewältigung and Geschichtsaufarbeitung. Geschichtsaufarbeitung is much the most neutral and actually the best term. Someone told me, I think it was Joanna told me yesterday, that academics in Poland sometimes use the term przepracowanie przeszłości, przepracowanie historii, but I haven't seen that often in Polish public debates, and I'm not sure how well it works. The usual terms one hears are, and going right back to the early 1990s, when I was gently suggesting that there might be more done about facing up to a difficult past and having a lot of quite strong arguments with friends, including Adam Michnik. The terms were lustracja, dekomunizacja, sometimes rozliczenia, all of which are deeply inadequate because they only describe a small segment of this whole process. And I think that was a problem with the Polish debate all along. Equally, I'm not sure there's a good Polish term for transitional justice. We were talking about this yesterday. Sprawiedliwość tranzycyjna. No, a nice, pithy, short term. Anyway, but I do seriously think that that's a problem of the Polish debate, that the framing question is not even there in the language. Now, to introduce this session, which is about globalization of transitional justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation, we have an exceptionally well-qualified panel. We have 4 speakers. We have just under an hour and a half. I hope you will forgive me if I don't introduce you all individually. All the biographies are here. Ruti has only asked me to propagandize Globalizing Transitional Justice, a new book of essays, which I happily do. Available in all good Amazons. I have asked our speakers if at all possible they could keep to 10 minutes, although they've been given 15. But as you know, in academic presentations, 4 times 10 equals 60. So I guess we'll go for about an hour, but still have some time for discussion. Ruti, would you like to kick off?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, I'll just segue from yesterday's lecture and suggest that we already have been hearing about globalizing transitional justice in the Polish case. And that is Professor Kubik's talk on the role of civil society. So what we see today and what distinguishes globalizing transitional justice as opposed to the national experiments of the 1980s is the fact that there are more actors and institutions involved. We're beyond the state and beyond the transition. And I think those two dimensions are important for us to think about in light of the problem that Poland is confronting today. So if you think about the role of civil society, for example, in the newest wave of transitions in the Middle East, or you think of where challenges to established histories is happening in Eastern Europe, we can see that there are many more actors involved in this quote-unquote project of transitional justice that doesn't have a name in the region. And so what does that mean for us? Well, I'd like to keep in mind this question of the change in transitional justice and whether beyond the original goals of democratization, which were thought to be the central aims in both Latin America, Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War, South Africa, beyond those aims, how do we ensure liberalization? And so I want to focus on this question of a liberal narrative and how Eastern Europe, as a general matter, dealt with these questions. So in the 1990s, we have the development, and I will, say that I identified this term, if we're talking about terms. The idea of transitional justice, as I used it, was the conception of justice associated with periods of radical political change. And I wrote about this in my first book, the idea that the role of law would be paradoxical, because generally the role of law is to emphasize continuity and stability, but that law would be caught between the backward-looking and forward-looking, and that this conception of justice, or the struggle over the conception of justice, really defined the period. And so we saw in Latin America a number of different confrontations. In Argentina, the turn to in the beginning, a truth commission, this wrestling with the repressive policies of disappearances, which were endemic to most of the continent, and then a turn to trials. In other countries, there was just the commissions of inquiry that sought to establish truths that had been repressed by the various governments about disappearances. But I think here, if we think about Eastern Europe and the uses of law in transition, we can think about some other approaches that were pursued on the continent. Obviously, the end of World War II trials, the Nuremberg trials, were one of the leading ways of dealing with the German atrocities of the past. Those trials were able to draw upon international law, and that's what gave them their sense of continuity. But there was also the discontinuity, the emphasis on individuals, even though in general these had been violations of the law of war that were attributed to states. Part of what we see and what I've written about and elaborated in other places is an emphasis on telling a story with a liberal ending. And that is, if we think about what do these transitional legal processes have in common, the law can construct transition through diverse processes, legislation, adjudication, and administrative measures. And we see that the role of the trials was essentially to isolate those who were criminal individuals in order to be able to let Germany reconstitute itself and become a democracy again. There are other ways that these transitional processes function, and so I just want to, since we've already started the conversation that's more specific to the region, think about these for a minute, and in particular the role of history, memory, and lustration. So the trial itself, as I've mentioned, tells this story, a liberal story, and in particular the human rights trials do this. They establish historical truths, and we've seen more recently than Nuremberg, the Argentine military junta trial. It's the anniversary of that trial, 30 years now, and also the trials at the ICTY of the Balkans henchmen, Milosevic, and others. They'll be remembered less for the condemnation of those individuals and more for the historical records that they establish. And again, an attempt to limit deniability and to move forward. Now, what are the narratives of transition that one might compare with respect to these examples and Eastern Europe? And again, I'm racing here out of concern for time. Well, the transitional narratives, for example, in Latin America, in places which were really dominated by tremendous political violence, begin in a tragic tone and they end somehow in a comic or romantic mode. I don't say comic in a facile way, but rather from a literary perspective, you have to somehow get from stories of affliction on a grand scale and somehow have some non-tragic resolution, some form of what Carolina has called for reconciliation. And what kind of reconciliation are we talking about? So, for example, in Argentina, where my studies of of this area began, despite these terrible moments, tens of thousands that were disappeared, tortured, and executed, many dropped alive into the sea. How do you move? How does a society move from those catastrophes, those tragic stories, somehow to move away from that, to deter future suffering? So the titles of these reports are, quote unquote, Never Again. They reference the Holocaust and they gesture to a future. And the idea here is that the knowledge of past suffering, that just knowing, that having those reports, and again, they were authored, Ernesto Sabato, Argentina's greatest author, by some, authored that first report. The idea is that that report itself, that knowledge and disclosure of past suffering, is somehow going to enable a future. To quote from the Chilean report, the truth had to be brought to light, for only on such a foundation would it be possible to create the necessary conditions for achieving true national reconciliation. And again, in Uruguay, which had an unofficial Never Again, a non-official report, they also talk about the revelation of knowledge itself as a means to political transformation. They say it's the lack of critical understanding which created a risk of having the disaster repeated. So this whole idea is that that somehow we can deter or postpone or avert another catastrophe or disaster through telling the story. The story has to come out right. The reports imply, therefore, a number of poetic leaps. And it really poses a question for us of what counts as liberalizing knowledge. What wasn't known? There had been many witnesses to disappearances in Latin America. After military rule there, somehow, where truth was really a casualty of disappearance policies, because the disappearances were followed by decades of denial and cover-up by the police, the critical response, the important transitional critical response or transitional history, was calling for an official story and acknowledgement by the government. We might contrast that view that it's that liberalizing knowledge that counts with what happened after communism. And here, I just want to, I'll be brief, but I just want to highlight the fact that in general, the search for truth in the region was not a matter of historical production. In fact, the official story had already been deployed as an instrument of repressive control. In most of the countries, there were state archives and a state surveillance. Whereas in Latin America, the military was a much more confined phenomenon and really didn't control history to that extent. What you find in Eastern Europe is that it's a matter of critical response to repressive state histories, to the securing of private access to the archives, to privatization of official histories, and to the introduction of competing historical accounts. And this is something that has already been alluded to yesterday, the importance of singling out particular moments to challenge the story told about in 1956 in Hungary, the suppression of the uprising there, the critique in Czechoslovakia to 1968 and to the repression, the beginnings of 1989, and in Poland, 1981. And so it's really about illuminating those gaps in history and introducing critical counter accounts that you find is of relevance in the region. But in general, you don't have the demand for establishing commissions of inquiry and the call for official truth. Of course, in unified Germany, which is a bit of an exception, you do have the parliamentary commission called, and the importance of having some regulation of the archives. And we know even the president today draws a great credibility from his having had that passed and the view that it was important to regulate those files. Now, I just want to just touch towards the end here on this question of the uses of the archives. And we've talked about lustration already. Tim mentioned this in the beginning, this Lustration. And in general, certainly Czechoslovakia was where these were used in the most extreme way. The opening up of Stasi files allowed the possibility of lustration, and in many ways it presented, I think, a controversial and problematic measure of disqualifying or attempting to reconstitute the civil service through the files and through the archives that had been associated with the prior regime. And in fact, lustration dates back to an early period in the Czech Republic, in Czechoslovakia, where it had been used for not such liberal means. So the real question here then, at the end of communism, was who had a legitimate state in those old state histories, to whom did they belong, and really two rules really loomed large. And I was lucky to be part of those early conversations, and I remember well being in a room with Habermas and other professors from the United States and from England, and Jan Elster called for the burning of the files. And he said, we've got to destroy those files. They'll be controlling us forever. And of course, that was one approach. That was the idea that somehow the past could be destroyed, and that then the country could somehow move forward. Of course, we know that's not so simple, and that there are other notebooks and other histories and other accounts, and that idea that somehow the past could be destroyed and you could have some kind of tabula rasa was one approach. As a lawyer, I can't resist introducing one or two other rules, which is that in general, and we see this with transitional justice, the notion that these measures are aimed at a liberal goal very much depends on their context, their purpose, and what we see in the region. And this goes back to the present and the way the past is controlling or somehow affecting the present, is we see a demand again for a form of militant democracy, for this idea that what we need is radical measures in order to guarantee democracy itself. And so if we think about some of the other approaches, not the destruction of the files, but either collective measures or highly individualized measures, certainly this is where the debate was in the region. And for some, they functioned in a much more sweeping way in the Czech Republic, with a much more severe lustration. And as we know, in Poland, it was the most informal and often dependent on self-disclosure and this idea that you should self-disqualify and use, and somehow report your past. And obviously, this is a range. There's a continuum. And the question of what the legitimacy is of that use of the past, I think, is very much with us for the rest of the day. And that what rules should apply, whether it should be highly individualized versus sweeping. Well, in highly individualized approaches, if they're not a trial and if it's not beyond a reasonable doubt, raises the possibility of political manipulation. And we certainly saw that historically in Poland as well. So, the question, I think that this long shadow of the totalitarian state histories, it can be seen in the region's ongoing struggle with this legacy of inherited state archives. Political change meant opening those archives, but opening the old state files wouldn't automatically bring about the open society. So the question for us really is how to deal with that inheritance and think about, at minimum, the permissive rules of access that govern established democracies are Freedom of Information Acts and so forth. And the importance, I think, no matter what is happening at the level of the state, to ensure counter-accounts and the kind of pluralism that Jan Kubik talked about yesterday, certainly in a region that has a history that's problematic in the production of official stories and official commissions of inquiry. I think that underscores that the critical response, more than any other, would be the emphasis on the privatization and on having a strong civil society, newspapers, media that reflects a liberal tradition. And I think I'll leave it there, and we'll have time for questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully, I stayed within the time. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ruti. I didn't mean to terrorize you with the time, but you packed in a lot of very interesting stuff in there. Thank you. James Connelly.
Thank you very much. So much time, so little to say, or do I mean so little time, so much to say? But that's also the nature of the issue that we're facing as it happens, and I'll explain that. There's both too little and too much time. Now, I would profess my ignorance of the topic if that weren't going to become apparent as soon as I start on my talk, so I won't say anything more about that. I have what follows, just short comments, queries and questions, and I'll try not to elaborate any of them. Transitional justice is a performative process. It's an activity in time. All actions take place in a now. Now, excuse the amateur etymology, but I always like the French word for now, maintenant, holding in the hand. There's that sense. I don't know whether that's really the case, but that's what it means to me. And I think that's an important thing, because that has a notion of including the past within the present. Now, a question. How long does it take to forgive or apologise? The answer, a moment and a lifetime at the same time. That's what I mean by too much and too little time, as it were. To apologise or to forgive is to act now, while holding the past in a way which exorcises its power, but doesn't abandon it. And that's the important trick. So, I want to say something about the presuppositions of forgiveness and reconciliation. It strikes me that there's an important truth in Emily Dickinson's words, the poet. The heart cannot forget unless it contemplate what it declines, she says. But maybe that should be forgive rather than forget. And the relationship between forgiveness and forgetting is the important one here. Forgiveness and reconciliation are integral to transitional justice. But are they compatible? Does forgiveness presuppose remembering? Does reconciliation presuppose forgetting? Some might argue this. We sometimes say in common talk, forgive and forget. But let's look at that. It implies that forgiveness facilitates forgetting, but equally at the same time, forgiveness clearly presupposes remembering. Only after that can we begin to forget what needs to be forgotten. The emphasis there is on what needs to be forgotten. The question is, what do we forget? Because the past, contrary to Jan Elster, is not going to be expunged. So we should not forgive and forget. We should forgive and remember in the right way. What is the right way? Remembrance as acknowledgement is the phrase I'm going to use, and I'll come back to this. How do we do this? Well, we work with what is at hand. The friend of reconciliation is conversation and activity. The enemy of reconciliation and forgiveness is reification. It's dealing with static entities which are immobile and cannot be broken down. We need to equally and obviously to avoid the mistake of believing in a necessary historical trajectory from a pure and perfect past to a pure and perfect future via a troubled and messy present. A lot of people still have this view of the historical process. I think they're probably wrong. Now, of course, our efforts to mend historical hurts are likely to be clumsy, prone to crass error. We feel as if we had to repair a torn spider's web with our fingers, Wittgenstein once said. And that's the image, It's a very clumsy, awkward process, but that's what it feels like trying to repair historical wrongs. Why does forgiveness presuppose remembering? Well, because remembering presents the topic for forgiveness as a live issue for us. If it weren't a live issue, there wouldn't be an issue, as it were. So if we need to forgive, it can only be because there's something unforgotten. It also presupposes that we continue to remember after forgiveness, but in the right way. By which I mean by acknowledging the events and injuries of the past. That is, we should not remember obsessively. Genuine forgiveness is the antidote to obsession. Carolina Vigora, who's just left the room as I'm about to quote her, reminds us that for Paul Ricoeur, it's a mistake to use too elevated a vocabulary here. We should use a more mundane, everyday vocabulary. We should be talking about normality rather than brotherhood, tolerating rather than loving. And instead of forgetting, we should speak of an end to brooding over things. And if anyone wants a good example of brooding over things and its dire consequences in a novelistic form, read Julian Barnes, Before She Met Me. It's so well worth reading that I've read it 4 times. But it's a great example of this sort of thing in a personal context. So it's not whether you forget, it's how you forget. It's not whether you remember, it's how you remember. Now, can we have reconciliation without forgiveness? If it requires forgiveness, it also presupposes remembering. If not, then forgetting might be the best way forward. I say that it presupposes forgiveness. The only thing possible in the absence of remembering would be unthinking conciliation rather than reconciliation. If we think of reconciliation, the The re is important there. It's a reconciliation. It's the restoration of a state of right relationship, as someone phrased it. A little more on remembering and forgetting. Although memory is, some argue, constitutive of the self, we are what we remember on this view, roughly, forgetting is also necessary to a self's healthy living in the world. And by a self, you can also refer to a collective, a state, a nation, larger selves too. Nietzsche, of course, famously called for active forgetfulness, but there's a paradox in that, obviously. But we clearly do need a balance between remembering and forgetting. And we need, to get that balance right, the ability to judge significance. That's the hard thing. Not everything that we remember is integral to ourselves. And not everything that we forget should be forgotten. The question of significance is important. I just have time for a small anecdote about Immanuel Kant. There's always time for an anecdote about Kant. The paradox of conscious forgetting. He had a servant who stole from him once. He dismissed him on the spot. He then started worrying about the guy he dismissed and thought, I better forget about this guy. So on his desk he wrote a note saying, the servant was called Lamper. He said, Lamper vergessen. Forget Lamper, in his face every day. So, are those who most try to forget those most condemned to remember? That's the point here. Trying to forget too hard gives us paradoxes. How do we remember then what is of significance, and how do we forget what should be forgotten? I don't have an answer. But reconciliation clearly requires a looking back, an acknowledgement of the past in the phrase that I used earlier. It is not reconciliation for nothing. But it also requires a moving forward into the future, active creation of something new, signalled and performatively made possible by forgiveness. I'm picking up on the Austinian point about performativity here, and I think that's an important thing. It's not reification, but activity that's important here. And each activity performatively creates something on which you can build. So that's the only way to do it. Forget the purity, in other words, move on. But don't move on while forgetting everything that has preceded. Quick note on apology and forgiveness. Part of forgiveness is being able to accept an apology, and that's both personal and collective. It also raises issues of who has the authority to do so. Who has the right to apologise for a collective harm? Who has the right to forgive a collective harm? There are issues here of representation, legitimacy and authority, which again were brought out yesterday. And we've seen this recently with someone forgiving an Auschwitz guard and so on. It raised a lot of questions, and these are always going to be there. Now I want to say something very quickly about the conception of history that we have, or perhaps need to have. Remembering as acknowledging includes the attribution of responsibility. And this implies that things could have been otherwise, which requires identifying the counterfactual conditional. If not this, then that, that sort of thing. And that's important for the future too. Without forgiveness and the reconciliation it makes possible, the future would be otherwise. We have to believe that. Some, of course, do and have thought of history as an inevitable process. But if it's an inevitable process, if you have a deterministic view, then there is no individual responsibility and no collective responsibility either. It would be just one damn thing after another, as Ford said, but deterministically, which is not what he meant. So history, in the way that Oakeshott understands it, has to be understood as contingent events. Things might have been otherwise. And on that basis, then we can then plausibly talk about individual and collective responsibility. So consideration of counterfactuals is integral to understanding history, but also to making history. And I think that's the important point. Some of you may want to ask me to distinguish between the past and the history, the historical past, the practical past. I won't do that now. I'm being short. Now, part of this is the idea not only that things could have been otherwise, but also that someone's to blame for it not being otherwise, as it were. But we have to be careful. We shouldn't go to the view that people are to blame for all of the summed consequences of their actions, or that they intended all of the summed consequences of their actions. One of the roots of conspiracy theories is precisely that you take everything to be intentional, down to the furthest consequences. And that, of course, means you can never make any progress if you really believe that. So, to identify any historical event as significant or important is to enter into the realm of the counterfactual, and this means making judgments of significance. Now, I'm just going to finish off by, first of all, quoting Walter Benjamin. You know, historians cannot make whole what has been smashed, but neither can we. In a certain sense, no one can. Reconciliation is the start of a new reintegration, but it can't literally mend. Bevanaj, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but that's how I'm pronouncing his name, uses Vladimir Yankeliewicz's distinction between an experience of the past as irreversible or irrevocable. Irreversible refers to an evanescent past, the things in the present which then move and, have gone. The irrevocable points to a stubborn past, one whose lineaments refuse to disappear. I have more to say about that, but perhaps in the questions we can say something about this. The key point here is that people in the present, in some circumstances, are what he calls living anachronisms. We're remnants of this non-absent past. Their memory marks the present of the past. What has scarred them will always irrevocably be there with them now and into the future. And no attempt at reconciliation which forgets that is going to get off the ground. The danger, Yankelevich and Bevanaj suggest, is that sometimes you find authorities thinking, okay, well, it's all gone. You can just forget it now. You don't feel it anymore, do you? But the past is a living past in this sense. The question of how it's a living past is one I won't go into at the moment. You can talk about encapsulation of the past in the present through memory, practices, inherited structures, collective beliefs, attitudes, and records of the past, of course, but they need to be understood in the light of other things to have salience in the present. If you want a concrete example, go to the United States of America, go to the southern states, check out some reenactment of the Civil War, read Confederates in the Attic by Tony Horwitz, Pulitzer Prize winner, great book, but not liked by the person at Fort Sumter I discussed it with, and I wonder why not. These things are very present. Now, finally, in my end is my beginning, if I can quote Eliot. Recently, I was explaining the virtues of cricket to a Turk, and I pointed out that I had never found a Greek or a Turk who understood the concept of a thrilling draw in cricket. I don't know whether any of you understand this either, but I'm sure some of you do. The response I got was, they're too impatient, Greeks, Turks, we're too impatient. I replied that I know some Greeks who still mourn the loss of Constantinople in 1453 and hanker for restitution. And the response I got was, well, that's a grudge. That's different. A grudge is different. And this is the point about time, in a sense. The moral of the story, grudges expand to fill the time available for their completion, and they are never completed. For reconciliation, there is no time like the present, and if you miss it, well, there'll be another present along in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Roman David.
Do
you want to?
No, I will give it up. I think this is not suitable here because people are sitting like this. I'll just keep, So good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. I will start with apology. We are in the conference which is about those apologies. I'll be presenting a framework of a book which has already been published because I think this is the best fit for this conference. Not that I don't do any other research. I'm working on other two books, but the thing is just that for this particular conference, I think it fits well. And so let me start with my topic, which is on lustration and reconciliation in Central and Eastern Europe. I would start with a statement that the topic of personal changes in unelected branches of state power is quite understudied area. unlike systematic studies of electoral systems, political science is less concerned about the judiciary and the administration. Studies in democratization seldom rectify this, although transitional justice literature is catching up, although I'm not sure from the right angle, because when it's dominated by lawyers, conceptions of administrative justice and non-criminal sanctions which pop out when we talk about lustration. I think this is a way where I think not much explanatory power for social scientists can be found. Obviously, the theoretical gaps which we have in this area, I think, had negative impacts on policy making. Not that politicians would ever listen, but still, if we don't have anything to offer, I think it is our problem. And we know that the misguided policies may bring negative consequences, not addressing the personal problem. We know that in Ukraine led to the relapse of autocratic regimes or continue to hamper democratic consolidation in Myanmar. On the other hand, enthusiastic addressing the problem, the personal problem, may be catastrophic, like case in Iraq and Libya show. So we have two ways. We can dismiss all or keep all, and then this kind of a wise man would say, so why don't you have some kind of a compromise? And the thing is that this kind of solutions, indeed, are always actually, kind of a way of compromise. It is never total exclusion, and it's never total continuation. And but what I would like to point the attention to is that people speak about these compromises, but they overlook the variety of different systems which appeared in Central and Eastern Europe after communism, systems which deal with personnel situation in the state apparatus. And we obviously know that some countries excluded discredited personnel, but we also know that other countries stipulated conditions for the inclusion and conversion. So for this is to look into the systems and see what we can get out of this. To start the inquiry, we need certain umbrella concept and a classification of these systems. And what I see is I try to conceptualize this as a personal system rather than kind of a issue of lustration or political isolation law, or etc. This is kind of an umbrella concept which reflects on the logic behind this special public employments law, rather than deals with this kind of nuances of who should be excluded and why and for what and when. And it is more kind of abstraction in the same way as electoral system is abstraction of election law, or constitutional system is an abstraction of constitution. We don't need to deal with this small type of nuances, but we look only at the defining features. And so the term personal system could be defined as a methods that are applied to deal with members of the repressive apparatus of the former regime in public positions in the aftermath of regime changes. Then how does this lustration fit into this? Lustration is one of those laws which deal with personnel, with generated personnel, and it's a simply personal system that uses lustration procedure. We have other systems which don't use lustration procedure, and they have the same objectives. Something is popping up always into my. So we can classify based on this. We can look, if we have this concept, we can classify the systems into several categories. System which is based on dismissal is the kind of traditional system which can be called exclusive, which originates in the Czech Republic, and is kind of more kind of aligning with the retributive strategy of transitional justice, and is kind of corresponding with, in parallel with criminal trials. let's say the other method, which originates in Hungary, is the lustration there was more based on revelation of the person's past. And so this system is essentially based on exposure, and it could be, because it doesn't really dismiss anybody, can be called inclusive. And then a conceptual parallel again is the kind of a revelation strategy, and empirical parallel, kind of a truth commission in transitional justice. And in Poland, the system is essentially based on self-revelation or confession, and the resemblance with the South African truth and reconciliation process, amnesty process in South Africa, where criminal justice, essentially or criminal responsibility, was waived on conditions of disclosure of truth. Based on this parallel, the system can be called reconciliatory, because it has a potential to, as in South Africa was demonstrated, perhaps could have this type of reconciliatory effects. And again, so it matches this type of strategy of transitional justice. Now, if we have now kind of a concept and then the variations, and obviously we have different concepts that we expect that these different systems and will have different effects. But it's also not that simple to see these effects in a very kind of instrumental ways. And I will try to. I argue that all in transitional situations, what is more pronounced is the symbolic meaning of those systems. So when we ask about effects, we need to distinguish the dualism between instrumental purposes of the law or of the system, and its symbolic or expressive, performative or ritualistic meaning, on the other hand. So this is a certain dualism, which is, which has been in European thought since Plato and Aristotle, and it's, chewed by cultural sociology, and it's just here in our understanding. And this type of symbolic meaning is they carry very important role in particular in transition, because in transitions are characterized by unpredictability. You are in a as the title says, in the state of flux. You just don't know where it would go. And so this is very important role, and suddenly there is a law which passes judgments on individuals, on whole era, and basically on persons, on whole political groups the persons belong to. So they signal belonging and exclusion. They signal who is in and who is out in the body of politics, and they signal in different ways that these systems discontinuity with the past. Now, it is very ironic that lustration also carries this dual meaning. It is not surprising, obviously, because in Western literature, the first thing the Western scholars do, they open the Oxford Dictionary and they see ritual purification. So they see that the Czechs, the Poles, they do some kind of ritual, kind of a purification. Now, what is interesting here is that in ancient Rome, where actually this ritual sacrifice role of lustration originates from, actually lustration was also instrumental process, and it gained this symbolic meaning based on what was actually performed with this instrumental process. So it is, the irony is that in the past, in Rome, and now the term lustration carries similar dual meanings, and obviously different lustration systems would have different instrumental meanings and different social or kind of a communication meaning, they convey different messages. And so the exclusive system, the kind of the instrumental effect is based on dismissal of a person. But if we look at the whole situation, what's happening in the society when is essentially leads to certain inversion. It leads to situations that those who were in power now out of power, they were up, they are down. So new people come and replace. So this kind of interestingly enough, it may have very powerful effects on the operation of the state apparatus, the instrumental effect. But in terms of transformation, it keeps the distance between the adversaries intact. So it doesn't transform, and perhaps even solidifies those divisions, because these divisions are no longer only historical, but they have been legalized through those laws. So they have been solidified into some kind of more tangible thing which would affect the future. Then inclusive systems, which tries to establish certain transparency in the state apparatus as kind of instrumental effect, they produce some kind of effect of kind of retroversion. They start to kind of rewriting the history in a way which may go in two directions. We can say that, on the one hand, this is kind of a classical truth commission problem, whether these truth commissions are leading to reconciliation or opening past wounds. So essentially, this is the same thing. If the collaborator is exposed and he denies that he did what he did was in the past, then he would say he would basically challenge the common notion of individual agency. He would say what matters is the structure. What matters is the responsibility is on the regime, and the regime is the one which forced me to do so. So it kind of go to the redefining of the past. And reconciliatory system also signifies certain transparency, but also certain kind of rejuvenation of the policy, because it produces this effect of conversion. It is very interesting to see the difference between exposure and conversion, because when we see that the collaborator himself says, I collaborated, has to submit some questionnaire, this is certainly a transformative measure. He is trying to redefine himself as a person who is more acceptable, who has perhaps learned or something, or at least we can say, from instrumental perspective, who is willing to play by the rules of the new system. If he doesn't pass this test, then he is dismissed. Obviously, this is the Polish, the beauty of the Polish system. So how can we study these issues? The thing is that it's really not easy to study this in historical context, because we know that in all countries, including Poland, after 1989, the personal changes took place. People were dismissed from positions. It happened in Hungary, and obviously in the Czech Republic as well, before Lustration law was enacted. So this creates similarities in all countries. Another issue is that other measures were also adopted. They are not considered usually as transitional justice measures, but they have similar symbolic meanings, such as elections. You defeat the Communist Party in elections by chance, by this almost same percentage in all these three countries. And it has a huge symbolic impact on some kind of historical justice, and cancelling the leading role of the Communist Party, changing its school curricula, etc., etc. These are changes which happen in all countries. So historically, it's difficult to control for this. So when I studied it, I put forward experimental study, and then what I found in the results is that these dismissals, they have positive effects on trust in government and justice. People like dismissals in all countries, in the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, but they have no kind of significant effect on reconciliation. They don't really see, there is not much effect, and there are two forces which kind of work against each other. Why they cancel is that this kind of this negative effect on reconciliation, that the solidifying of the past, is offset a little bit by kind of alleviating desires of people for retribution. So therefore, this kind of contrary effects cancel themselves. Inclusive systems, no really significant effects detected, And reconciliatory system shows that a positive effect on trust in government, positive effect on justice, and also positive effect on reconciliation and forgiveness. So what we can conclude, what I conclude, the Polish system of lustration is intellectually the most attractive and empirically the most transformative. And because I am here in the Polish, largely Polish setting, and I know that a lot of Poles are admirers of the Czech lustration systems. So is there any admirer of the Czech lustration from Poland who would be willing to exchange the lustration laws? Is anybody dare to say? Because you see, what is the problem is that I would be happy to switch with you. You know, the Czech lustration system, because it comes with a package. You know, and this is the Communist Party, and it comes with a Communist Party in the Czech Republic which is untransformed, and in my view untransformed because of the operation of the lustration system, which hampered that transformation. And in Poland, where it doesn't really concern the SDL, simply because the SDL was no longer communistic, or if ever it was communistic in the 1980s. So that would be my kind of answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman. I think there's someone who's going to take you up on your offer, but first, Joanna Wawrzyniak.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm in a difficult position as I'm not an expert on transitional justice and law. Perhaps I do not like to tell other people what they should do. But as some of my previous work concerned the public memory of World War II and communism in Poland, I was asked by Karolina to comment on some general lines of recent developments of Polish memory culture, including the so-called museum boom. In the context of this panel, I want to present an argument on dissociated memory cultures in Poland that have not formed any common ground for reconciliation. My talk is based on observation of the development of dominant memory narratives since the end of World War II and of recent memorialization practices in Poland's new flagship history museums. Warsaw Rising Museum, Schindler Factory Museum, Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, European Solidarity Centrum, and others. The newly opened contemporary history museums, or the running projects of to-be-opened or not history museums, as Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk, are characteristic for the period of transition because, to steal a phrase by Ruti Teitel on law in transition, the museums too are caught between past and future, between backward-looking and forward-looking, between retrospective and prospective. The beginning of the so-called museum boom in Poland is usually marked with the opening of Warsaw Rising Museum in 2004. The majority of the museums that were opened later in one way or another defined their position in relation to Warsaw Rising Museum. Importantly, these newly opened contemporary history museums have attracted a lot of media attention. In a way, public debates concerning these museums cover up earlier discussion and controversies concerning representation of history in Auschwitz and in other sites of former Nazi concentration and extermination camps, although also in those places new exhibitions and memorials have been recently opened or revised. History museum boom happened in an important structural context. Poland joins EU, the country's economy grows, the state and municipalities can afford new initiatives. The main flagship museum projects are followed not only by many other publicly funded activities, but also by the huge Catholic Church memorialization initiative. Still, what has attracted public and international attention are only a few main projects, which I'm sure many of you know very well. So I'm not going to describe the content, but to offer an interpretation of their function. In some readings, the museum boom can be interpreted as a response to the neoliberal farewell to the past of the first decade of transformation. The process of neoliberal modernization of 1990s appeared to drive Polish society into a future that involves multiple changes, a future which did not unfold smoothly but with shocks. Remembering became a relevant issue vis-à-vis conflicting social processes. Historical museums are important in this respect because they constitute part of the morally and emotionally shaped social and ideological landscape. The issue at stake in Poland is they do it in a competitive way. In this respect, I like to loosely refer to the concept of non-simultaneity of the simultaneous proposed by interwar German thinkers Ernst Bloch and Wilhelm Pinder in a totally different context. Polish contemporary history museums do not, to paraphrase Bloch, exist in the same now. They do so only externally, through the fact that they can be seen today. The concept of non-simultaneity denies the existence of a meaningful relation between events that occur in different subjectively experienced times. Polish history museums, built on different conception of history and time, perform different functions for the local and global audiences. Moreover, due to at least three factors, the funds involved, the public engagement of some of their staff and critics, and the enormous media interest, they really nearly contribute to mnemonic standoff, to borrow a concept by James Wedge, by developing divergent and contested foundational myths of the Polish Republic. Before I present some illustration of this, I would like to bring your attention to a standard model of a museum taken from the literature of the so-called critical new museology that deals with reconciliation in the realm of culture. The criteria of which, in my opinion, Polish flagship museums do not and cannot fulfill under the present political and social conditions. The metaphors of temple and forum museums, borrowed from art historian Cameron Duncan, stand out among various concepts of the so-called new museology movement. The movement was influenced by the post-structural theories and narratives of the 1970s and 80s, by post-colonial discourse, as well as by changes in technology and consumer society. The new museology has been initiated to the reconciliation discourse, especially through the studies and ethnographic museums and later history museums in countries such as Canada or Australia that have undergone transformation of the way they conceive relation between indigenous communities and their colonizers. The new museology stood obviously on the side of the forum and believed that museums were able to support social transformation and to even have therapeutic or healing potential. As one of the nesters of this movement, Eileen Hooper Greenhill says, she describes the forum as a post-museum that negotiates responsiveness, encourages mutually nurturing partnership, and celebrates diversity. The forum is open to diverse accounts of the same historical events and discusses formally one-sided interpretation. And there is an extensive discussion in the museum literature today what are the problems of the forum, and that the forum also have their limit as to the views they allow to present. I don't have time to go into that deeply now. At this point, I would like to move to the final part of my talk and to give a handful of examples on why the Polish history museums are not capable of being agents of reconciliation process. First, they vary as to their foundational myths, and secondly, there are important debates about the particular museums that show that there are salient disagreements on what they actually present. If we take three of these flagship museums, Warsaw Rising Museum, European Center of Solidarity, and Polin, each of them represents different approaches to national history. As my German colleague, Florian Peters from Munich says, these distinct foundational narratives promoted by the museum's exhibition can all be placed in the mainstream post-solidarity spectrum. The Warsaw Rising Museum represents the traditional exclusivist version of Polish nationalism and has been embraced by the conservative wing of the anti-communist opposition. The liberal national story of a successful liberation through peaceful self-organization, which was typical for the opposition elite, is presented in the European Center of Solidarity permanent exhibition on the history of solidarity. The Polin Museum finally stems from the desire to come to terms with difficult questions on Polish-Jewish relations, which were initially brought to the fore by critical opposition intellectuals in the 1980s and became politically relevant with the global establishment of Holocaust memory at the end of century. Such historical pluralism is by no means problematic as long as common sources and mutual entanglement of different political and historical visions are consciously reflected upon and acknowledged. Some aspects of public debate over the past in contemporary Poland, however, hints at the opposite, at the lack of mutual acknowledgement that is grounded in different and divided judgments on the processes and outcomes of transformation. But not only differences between the museums, but also salient variation of the readings of the exhibition by the creators and the critics. It's enough to underline that the chief curator of the exhibition, Barbara Kirschenberg-Gimbert, inscribes the museums into critical museology, describes the museums in terms of self-reflexive transparency. She sees the museum commitment to the exposing conflict, empowering viewers, and redressing inequalities. The view is not shared by the Polish progressive left. In her recent essay titled The Embassy of Poland in Poland, I'm finishing in 2 minutes, the Polin myth in the Museum of the History of Polish Jews as narrative pattern and model of minority-majority relation, the Polish culture critic Elżbieta Janicka disapproved of the museum exactly for failing to create a critical exhibition. Instead, according to Janicka, the museum recreates the myth of Polin as its master narrative and as a principle that delegitimize alternative narratives. The essence of her argument against the museum is that it distorts and decontextualizes Jewish experience by putting it into the coherent, readable, and plausible, into the narrative readable and plausible to Polish audience. In the same book that Janicka essay was published, a museum expert from Canada, Erika Lehr, tried to find an in-between way by stressing that the political anxieties of Polish progressives and nationalists alike distort both past and present, both maintain essentialist categories. Both sides not only deny the historical agents their own diversity of perspective, but also they assume that visitors are not having their own readings and experience of the exposition beyond the narrative framework of its creators. Lehr tried to find a solution, wondering what models of critical museology might be productive in the Polish context. She calls for a slow museology, which sees exhibition, program, and institution building in terms of long-term community engagement and evolution, and understands failures as a part of a necessary process of developing new ways of thinking and relating. If this is a path to follow, it's yet to be promoted by both key museum makers and their discontents.